Welcome to Modern Sex Talks. We are a podcast that's dedicated to giving you the know-how and support to have the best sex life and intimate relationships you dreamed of. We hope you enjoy.
Welcome to Modern Sex Talks. I'm your host, Ryan Thomas. Our guest today is well known as the Love Guru, after being on ABC's The Bachelor as a relationship coach for The Bachelor and one of his ladies. Today, she's going to share with us what vulnerability is and why it's your most powerful asset in a relationship. If you haven't yet, please go to iTunes and leave us a review. The more reviews we have, the easier we're able to find, so that's the biggest thank you you can give us. And feel free to sign up to our newsletter and get a free report on how you can earn more respect and set healthy boundaries in your relationships. Now, enjoy the show. Tziporah Kingsbury, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. I'm super excited to be here. Yeah,
excited to have you. So why don't you take about 60 seconds to 2 minutes to tell us who you are and what it is that you do. I think you do a much better job in telling everyone that information than me trying to summarize it all.
Awesome. I only have 2 minutes, so just kidding. So I'm an international transformational leader in intimacy and relationship. I call myself an alchemist. Some people call me an expert. But what I do is I work with entrepreneurs, spiritual leaders, and couples who often get caught up in the stress of making things happen in their life, where this place of passion turns to force, and it goes from the business and then it rolls over into their personal life. And I guide them to really tapping back into their sensual, sexual, and intimate self, so they can learn to really communicate again and live from their power and feel that they have the skills and the tools to really create profound relationships from the bedroom to the boardroom.
So you left out a key little detail there, Miss Love Guru.
I did. I forget that all the time.
So I know that wasn't a title that you gave yourself. That's a title that someone else has given you, and it's kind of been following you around a bit. Can you tell us about why you've got that title?
I can. So about 2 years ago, the producers of The Bachelor sought me out for the work that I do. So yes, I was on ABC's The Bachelor, and they coined me the Love Guru. They brought me on to give an awakening intimacy session to The Bachelor and one of his dates. And so it was a phenomenal experience, because to me, it was like walking through a new door for mainstream TV to bring that level of vulnerability and work on such a show. So I was very honored to be a part of it.
Awesome. So why did you get into this sort of thing? I always find this really interesting, how people get into being a relationship coach or sex coaches or sex therapists, counselors, things like that. There's always a really interesting story that sort of leads into it, because it's kind of like, we get into this sort of thing. I know I kind of started to get into this stuff so I could fix my own shit and my own issues. And so I think that's kind of common. We always try to help other people before we start to help ourselves. And then once we start into the work, we realize that we help ourselves. It's better to help ourselves first and then help other people. Anyways, I'm rambling, but it's, I always find this really fascinating. So I'm curious, what's your story?
Yeah, and it is. We often, we do teach what we need to learn. My story, it's been about 2 decades. So about 2 decades ago, 20 years ago, I was actually a competitive bodybuilder. I competed for 6 years on stage, and I ran a very successful nutrition business. I educated people about body science,
You started when you were 10 years old?
Thank you. Yes, I started very young.
I have seen your pictures.
This is what happens when you're in this line of work. So you stay very youthful. So yeah, and it was at that time in my life where I pushed myself so hard. I have extreme discipline, and I wasn't very connected to, I want to say, my emotional body, so my emotions. And as well, my relationships weren't meeting where I was at. And I got to the point that I actually pushed myself so hard. I woke up one day and I could barely walk. I put on about 30 pounds in 48 hours.
What?
Yeah.
Sorry, can you say those numbers again?
I put on about 30 pounds 48 hours.
30 pounds in 48 hours.
Yes.
How is that physically possible?
So, this is the whole thing about discovering I call it our body intelligence. Our body is intelligent. And often in one way or not, when we put our body in harm's way, not taking care of it, the disease forms, right? So for me, I was pushing my body beyond its limits. It was exhausted. There were signs that physically, from being tired all the time to my body fat not dropping anymore for my next competition. And I added more spin classes on, and I'm like, I'm going to make this happen, and I'm going to work ultra hard. And so that's basically what the body did. The body's like, I need to stop her. Otherwise, who knows what she's going to do to herself. And so often what happens physically, right? The adrenal shut down, the cortisol level rises. And so, a lot of it, water, the water gain, the body just expands and blows up. And so it was a time in my life where everything that I thought was my whole life was lost. And my physical body, which was my business card at the time, was also, disappeared. And I didn't even know who I was anymore. And so because I was already helping people, into loving their bodies and learning more about how to move their bodies. I was depressed for about a month. I was really, really low. It was hard for me to leave my house. And I sat there and I questioned myself. I said, either I can sit here and stay like this and feel this and be depressed, or I can do something different, because I knew that no one else could do it for me. There was no one else that was going to change this experience for me. And that just came to me naturally. I don't know why. It was a natural thought I had. And so I did. I picked up and I started going to bookstores and studying and learning. And then a few months later, the big changes came, because I knew I needed to do something different, because I was still running my business, and I knew this was an evolution. This was time for me to shift something in the way that I work with people. So I Googled, like we all do, right? Google knows everything. And
the all-knowing oracle.
All-knowing. And I Googled, I don't remember what I Googled, but I knew that I wanted to be someplace where I could learn. However, where I can also access my own self-transformation, because I knew it had to start with me first. And so what popped up on the internet was the International School of Shiatsu and Cranial Sacral in the middle of the Swiss Alps. And when that popped up, I was like, you got to be kidding. I had never left America in my life, and I had no intention of leaving the States, because I am from the States. And
no one's perfect.
No, thanks. I know. I'm sorry. I just admitted that. And I picked up. I decided to sell everything I owned. I sold my business, sold my furniture, my place, moved in with my mom to save money. And 8 months later, I left my cat on my mom's doorstep, packed a big suitcase, and off I went to Switzerland. And this was a school that housed teachers from every tradition, spirituality, healing, natural healing. It was a macrobiotic institute. And that was the start of my new journey to my self-discovery and to starting to really get in touch with me. And that day I committed to cultivating a profound relationship with my own body, mind, sexuality, and spirit. I became celibate for 7 years.
Whoa. Whoa. That's a long time.
I'm pretty intense with discipline.
Apparently so. When you set your mind to something, holy crap.
It's a gift I have.
Yeah, I guess, yeah.
What I realized, when I do things, it was the same as bodybuilding. When I do things, I want to do it, and I want to do it 100%. And what I recognized then, when I looked at my personal relationships, when I looked at my sex life, when I realized I didn't even know who I was anymore, and I had all this emotional baggage or heaviness, I didn't want to settle anymore for those kind of relationships. And I knew that in order for someone to meet me in the way that I really wanted to be met, it really wasn't going to happen until I could go to that level of extreme. And so it was a beautiful journey. And as soon as I got to Europe and I dove in and I instantly started leading seminars and seeing clients in new ways. I lived throughout Europe for almost 6 years, studying with different teachers and traditions. And that's a bit of my journey. And, I do believe that if I'm going to teach anything to someone else, I better know what that experience feels like, because I don't teach from a book. I teach more from the body experience. So,
I am behind you 100%. 100%. That's leading by example.
mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it sounds like as well that you, with this depression, because we're about to get into this here too, that you, when you were first experiencing that depression, you said that you could sit there and you could just, basically you could sit there and identify with it, like, oh, you're a terrible person, that you failed, and you can identify with it, or you can use it as a catalyst for growth, which is exactly what you did.
Yeah, and
and now you're the love guru.
Now I'm the love guru. Who would have thought 2 decades ago that would be my reality? I didn't. So yeah, there's a key to that, and there's most people think it's black or white. It's one or the other. That sit and identify with it and let it take over us, or let's instantly grow, use it as a stepping stone to grow into something else. But I'm going to say there's something in the middle of that's essential that a lot of people miss, and it's the honoring that state of conscious mourning, and honoring what you're feeling. And most people deny it. Most people, when they jump to, oh, I want to use this as a catalyst to change my life, they skip over that piece of acknowledging what they're feeling.
Oh, thank you so much for saying that. That's called spiritual bypassing. When you skip past those feelings that you're feeling.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it happens so often, I think, as we know, and I believe that it happens just out of a lack of understanding. And I believe we all have the same intent and direction that we want to go. I just think it's just people don't have the information it was never meant to jump over those emotions. However, it's also not meant to become the victim and get sucked into them. But it's an art to, wow, okay, so I'm going to share a story. So imagine our emotions. Imagine our emotions were people. And we have anywhere from the sadness, the anger, the grief, the rage, the panic, the pleasure, all these feelings in our body. And if we push those feelings, because they're people, and shut the door on them, what's going to happen to that feeling, right? It's going to pound at the door. And it's going to come out in some way in our life. And that might be having really poor communication skills. It might be, being triggered in certain situations. It might be habitually drawing the same relationship to us time and time again. But what will happen if all of a sudden, say, rage knocks at your door? And at first, you're like, I'm going to open this door. I want to see who's there. And you open the door and rage is there and it's on fire. And it's like just crazy rage and it's yelling. And you look at it with an open heart and you just sit there and you say hello to rage. And rage is like, I don't know if I want to trust her. What's this crazy person doing? People usually slam the door on me. And rage still, goes on and on and on. And eventually you invite rage in for a cup of tea. And suddenly rage gets curious. And it might shift to anger, because anger does feel different than rage. It's a little less intense. And so anger's like, I'm really angry at you, but I might step on toe through the door. And then eventually anger starts to get more and more curious, because you start to get more and more inviting and loving to anger. And eventually anger might come in the door and turn to fear. And so fear might be confused and walking around the room, but then eventually you sit on the couch and you're like, would you like a cup of tea? Would you like some biscuits? And eventually anger, fear, and then turns to sadness, and sadness is sitting next to you. But now sadness is much softer than rage was. And so when we can see these parts of ourselves as personas that actually need to be understood and heard, they can no longer have control over us. And then it also kind of gives us permission. Wow, I'm not necessarily that. Like, it's two separate people sitting on the couch, but it's living inside of me. And so I want to get to know this part of me, because this part of me, the panic, the upset, the sadness, has a need that simply wasn't met. And in order for those feelings to shift or change, we need to finally start to listen to them. Otherwise, when we do that spiritual bypass and we think we're doing something positive, because often that's what's thought, is it's still going to weigh us down and limit us in some way unconsciously.
Oh, that was so eloquent. That was so well, like, yeah, it's so true. And I like how you went through those emotions, because it is basically talking about those deeper reasons behind the emotions that come at you, either from within yourself or from someone else. Anger is usually driven by fear, which is driven by sadness or being let down or whatever. And there's a lot of vulnerability that comes into play to actually admit that I'm angry because I'm sad. You know, there's so much vulnerability in putting yourself out there that way. And that can be a really, really hard thing to do. And it's not even necessarily being vulnerable to someone else, but also vulnerable to yourself and looking in the mirror. Why am I so angry? Oh, it's because maybe I'm a little scared, or maybe I'm a little sad.
Yeah, and that vulnerability piece, I'm not here to say it's easy. It's my journey hasn't been easy. However, there is greater ease, which is different than easy, when we choose to listen to those places and maybe ask ourselves, and invite the people who listen here, is ask yourself, what do you really want? Most of us want love and connection. And if I am choosing not to be vulnerable, and because I'm scared or I'm angry and I'm hurt, I'm going to ask myself that question. Am I creating more intimacy or connection here, or am I creating separation? And I'm typically creating separation if I'm not opening up in that way. And then I'm going to ask myself, well, is it worth it? How bad do I want intimacy and connection in my life? And this doesn't mean necessarily with the person that maybe we're projecting those emotions onto, but it means just in general, like the big picture of life. Do I want intimacy or connection, or do I want to live feeling separate? So I love that question, because it inspires people to, it gives us leverage to do something different.
Yeah, totally. There's this idea behind the ego. The ego is basically, there's the ego, and then there's our heart, and our heart is connected to the source, and the source is connected to everything, kind of like love. And then the ego is what separates us and lets us know that we are, that I am not the lion, and I shouldn't put my head in the lion's mouth because that's a bad thing, and I should go and eat, and I should procreate. So the ego is separate. And obviously, the more we start to feel love, the more we start to feel connected to everything, and that scares the ego. And so feeling this pain, it can be kind of this weird erotic exchange that tells us that, hey, I am separate, I exist. I hurt, so I must exist. So there's this sort of interesting play and dance that we can have with these negative emotions. And then sometimes, like you had done before with your depression, you could have sat there in that negative emotion and identified with that, and for your ego to say, I exist. But instead, you went deeper and you became quite vulnerable in admitting that, oh, there's something deeper here. And then you moved through it.
Yeah. And it's go deeper, right? That's what we want to tell people is, I'm here to share that, emotion, our feeling, whatever they're at, that they're all valuable, and they are our biggest teachers. I like to say, create this ally relationship with your emotions. because they are bringing us messages. I had a client once, and, vulnerability was he originally came to me because he's like, I want to be a better lover. And the first day he sat with me, what we uncovered was that thing of being scared to be vulnerable. And he, he had issues around his sex life, and he couldn't get an erection anymore. And he was having these relationships that were unfulfilling. He had this checklist of the right woman for him. And he was just so stuck in his mind that it was it was protecting him. And he didn't know how to open up vulnerably. So when he was in bed with his lover, is that he didn't know how to have those conversations of why he couldn't get an erection. He was so clamped up because he felt to be vulnerable, right, meant he wasn't masculine, and there was something wrong with him, and this person would think he was crazy. And what happened is when he became friends with that vulnerability, and with his even with his upset and his insecurity around his sexuality, and he gained the confidence to actually be radically honest about that, what do you think happened? His sex life really changed. And when we are able to be not just vulnerable, but radically honest, it frees up our minds, it frees up our nervous system, and those thoughts, those emotions loosen their grip on us. And then truly our experience is going to change.
Yeah, that's like you hit on a really big point there. Something that hit home for me, because it's definitely something that I've come from in the past, is not wanting to be like in the sexual scenario, what you had mentioned, that he was too scared to bring it up, or he just didn't even have the emotional awareness to bring it up, because as guys, we're not really taught how to be in touch with our emotions. We're taught to sort of ignore them, right? And emotions mean weakness. And yeah, so since men are supposed to be strong and emotions are weakness, then we won't feel our emotions, which means we can't be vulnerable, because being vulnerable means showing emotion, which means being weak. So therefore we shut off entirely, and then it manifests in those sorts of ways of losing a partner, because you can't open up and say what it is that you actually need. So I guess how do you know if someone because that's the fear. Like, what if I open up and someone's going to hurt me? That's the fear that I used to have. So what do you say to that? How did you help him open up and admit what it was that he was feeling, and have those conversations with his partner?
Well, it comes back to the question I mentioned earlier, is asking ourselves, what do we want? And more than anything, we want love and connection. And I'm going to bounce around just a little bit. I had a call with a young woman, and she's young, in a marriage, very unhappy. And she asked me, she's in tears, and she asked me, she's like, are you going to help my relationship fit? Are you going to help me fit into my relationship, is what she said. And I said to her, I said, no, I'm not. But I'm going to help you fit back into yourself. And that, to me, that's the answer to that question, is someone else can't hurt us if we are radically honest with ourselves. I am going to share all parts of myself for me, not to get something from someone else, not to get them to love me, not to get them to treat me differently. But when I am moving from a place, wow, I'm going to share my thoughts or my vulnerability because I want to. Because I know if I don't, it means that I'm contracting. It means my energy is stopping to flow. It means I'm harming myself. And the mirror to that is, when I'm harming myself, I'm not going to have the connection with the people I'm with. So if I'm open and vulnerable, like my client was open and vulnerable, do you think that relationship he was in continued? It didn't continue. But what happened is he became single. He dove in and did this deep self-work. And at the end of working together for 90 days, what do you think he did then? Is he finally attracted this woman who was a yoga teacher. Like, she knew her communication skills. She was mindful, because that's who he was. So his relationship wasn't meeting him anyway. And so I understand for many people that's a really scary idea, to be who you are, knowing that the relationship you're with, it might fall apart. However, how bad do you really want 100% connection?
Yeah, this is a solid question. I mean, one of my mentors is he said, our protection comes in our defenselessness. So basically, when you take down all those walls and you truly show who you are, there's no more buttons, because you've already been honest with yourself. Like, he didn't use those words. I'm using those because that's what you said, and it's basically the same thing in different words here. You've been honest and with yourself and faced those things yourself. So you basically don't have any more buttons. No one can push those buttons. No one can hurt you emotionally, because you face who you are 100% every single day, and you've basically healed all of those wounds. Yeah. That's really powerful stuff.
Yeah. And I think the thing is too, everyone wants to be seen. Everyone wants to be heard. Everyone wants to be understood. But if they're not truly sharing who they are, how are people going to do that?
Yeah, you're not actually developing real connections and real relationships when you're not showing who you are. Mm-mm. Instead, you're developing a relationship with someone who likes your persona.
Yeah. It takes courage. It takes real self-discipline to cultivate that connection with yourself. There was a choice I made at the beginning of this year to go through a conscious relationship transition with my primary partner. And I'm sharing this, I want people to know that I understand what I'm saying. It's not easy, but the decision we made was reflecting on, wow, what we both want, we're actually starting to go in opposite directions, and we immensely love each other. But most people stay because they love each other, even though their values are starting to become polar opposites. And that's going to create a lot of havoc in relationships.
How do we know how much to share? I mean, if someone hasn't really done any sort of internal work around, being a bit more vulnerable and facing those darker elements, how do we know how much to share, or how much is too much? Mm-hmm. I've definitely had coffee with some people where, this is before I'd done any sort of work. I mean, now it doesn't bother me. I've had people share pretty much everything under the sun with me, and it just doesn't really faze me anymore. But several years ago, I'd have some people that would share some pretty personal, like very, very personal stuff, and I'd get really uncomfortable. But I mean, was it because they were sharing too much? Or was I just uncomfortable? How do we know? How do we play with that?
It's a tricky question.
It is a tricky question. It is, because there's two elements. Yeah. There's two people in those types of interactions.
Yeah. So I'll give you a couple of the answers. For myself, I don't believe I can ever share too much, but that's just because I'm okay with sharing a lot. If I'm in a conversation,
I'm sorry. I just had this picture on the bus. Not that I do this, but I was just picturing myself just masturbating on the bus. Like, what are you doing? I'm just sharing myself. Okay. I'm being authentic to who I am right now. Okay. And I'm sharing. I have some weird shit going on inside my head sometimes. It was just like an instant flash inside my head, and I couldn't really stop laughing.
That's awesome.
With that.
That's awesome. Thank you for sharing that.
I am being authentic, Tziporah.
I so appreciate that. So here's the thing. So, the more present we become, the more aware we become, we're going to be aware of the environment we're in, so there's practicality to it. What are the boundaries involving the environment we're in? So there's going to be an importance of taking that into consideration. But if I'm having a conversation with one other person, or I'm in a circle of people and I'm not sure how much they want me to share, I'll ask. I'll be inquisitive. Be like, I have this really personal share I want to share. Are you available to listen? Do you feel that's okay in this space? Ask questions. You can never communicate too much. I was with this teacher, this guy once. He was a friend, but he's an amazing expert. And it was so funny. We were connecting, and when we were on a date, and he sat in front of me, and he spews out all this information about how foolish he felt and how embarrassed he felt and all his concerns. And I mean, these things that were just off the wall. And then the evening there was ease because he just was completely authentic and didn't try to pretend he was someone he wasn't. So I'm going to go down that list again. So basically ask, be inquisitive, pay attention, know the boundaries of the environment you're in, and be present to that. And also check in with yourself. Why are you sharing it? What are you feeling in your body when you're sharing it? When you do share it, are you projecting it out on someone else? Or do you have an agenda? Or do you truly just want to be heard? Like, why are you sharing it? And if you go to share it and it's something really intimate with, say, your partner or someone new that you're dating, tell them that. Say, you know what? I'm feeling a little embarrassed, or I'm feeling a little shy right now, but I really want to share this vulnerable share with you. Tell them it's a vulnerable share. So I work with people on communication all the time, and you can never communicate too much.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Communication has been a big thing for me. I used to have a problem with my communication, and then I went and did some trainings in NLP, neuro-linguistic programming, and then after I had started applying those lessons that I had learned on all those trainings, all of a sudden my evaluations at work would go up on, like, in communication. And yeah, in the military we have these personnel evaluation reports, and on those it specifies verbal communication and another one, written communication, and my evaluations instantly started to go up after, like, paying a lot more attention to my communication. And going back to the other intent, like, why are you sharing it? Something that I used to do when I was feeling really insecure, and I had started sharing a lot more for that period of time. I was learning about vulnerability. I would just share because I felt really apologetic. And then that wasn't really helping anyone. That wasn't really helping me, and that wasn't really helping the person that was in the situation. It was just because I felt apologetic for something, and then I would just basically spill the beans to try to get them to approve and say that it's okay. That was I mean, that's a personal example, and some things that I did where that kind of vulnerability didn't help build the relationship. Instead, it actually kind of built a wall.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's why it's key. I love that question. Why am I sharing it? Where's my agenda? Or do I really want to just share because I want to be heard? I want this person to know me at a deeper level.
Yeah. And I find that I find that the more vulnerable I am in my relationships, and the more I actually share with someone, the more she shares with me, I just find that, my sex life gets really good. Because I can start to ask for what it is that I like, and she can ask for what she likes, and then neither of us feel upset or hurt for doing that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And again, so yeah, because if I'm in a relationship and
just to switch gears, I ended up switching gears and went right to sex. There wasn't much of a segue.
That was actually on my mind, so I was right there with you. I was like, pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. So you read my mind. So yeah, so if I'm in a relationship and I am not 100% open and vulnerable, that means, right, we already talked about this. It means that there's not going to be as much intimacy and connection. There's just going to be more distance and separation. Okay. And so right, that rolls over into the bedroom, into the sex life, into how much pleasure that we're going to feel. But if I'm already open and 100% vulnerable in me, whereas honestly, I'm going to tell you right now that our emotions are ultra place for turn on. And when we are able to share our emotions from an empowered place, so say I'm able to talk to my partner in a way that, wow, this is what I'm feeling, but I'm not telling him it's his fault, but I'm being honest. This is what I'm feeling, and I might cry a little bit, and I'm upset, and we go in and try to break it down a little bit. My partner actually gets ultra turned on, to the point that he gets an erection. It's so sexy. And so, because why? It's because, he's actually seeing me, and I'm not blaming him for anything, but he's feeling me more because now I'm more open. So that's one level that it turns up that area of pleasure. And the next is like, yeah, then if we're comfortable in sharing those really scary emotions, how easy do we think it's going to get now to go into the bedroom and start to share our fantasies, our desires, and how we want to be touched, maybe exploring something new with a partner that we've never told them before. And so there's so many levels to being vulnerable, and how it could actually be, I'm going to say it could be foreplay.
Yeah. Yeah, I can. Now you said two really good things there. There was I read this book called The Erotic Mind. I've mentioned it before on the show, and I highly, highly, highly recommend the book, The Erotic Mind by Jack Morin. And he basically explains that eroticism it's the emotions that drive passion in sexuality, and that without emotions, sex is just physical. And that's often why, when you have sex with someone and there isn't really any emotional charge, it's kind of flat, or like you wonder, well, seemed like everything was going well and there was good moves, but why wasn't it all that good? But usually our best sexual experiences are when there's a big emotional charge. And that's also why people can end up losing the passion, because there isn't any emotional charge in the relationship. And this right here could be a fantastic way to start to spark some of that emotion, to spark that charge. Because here's another example that's directly related to this. A girl that I was seeing last year, she said that she dated her ex-boyfriend prior to me for 2 years, and she said that they knew each other, but they didn't really know each other. And that's 2 years. That is a 2-year relationship, and that kind of blows my mind. But I think that right there, and what you said about sharing these negative emotions, can be a great way as foreplay to spark that passion back into the relationship, if maybe it's died, or if you just want to also deepen intimacy in the relationship as well.
Yeah.
So I guess it can deepen intimacy, and it can also really improve your sex life.
Yes, to all of the above. Think about it. Why typically when we first get together, when people get together, when start dating someone, there's an attraction to really who they are. Because if someone notices someone from across the room, typically when they're looking at someone across the room and they're seeing someone's like essence and energy, that person's totally being themselves. And so that's what attracted them in the first place. And what starts to happen right in those longer term relationships is that dwindles away. The emotions build up, they get suppressed, they don't talk about it anymore. They stop being their, what's coming to me right now is just like this real radiant person standing on top of like a mountaintop, like really big and out there. And so, yes, express. And though the key to expressing, and this is keynote, is a lot of people, because they don't necessarily have the skill around the communication piece, is be mindful when you're expressing that you are taking ownership for what you're feeling. It's not about expressing and vomiting and projecting it onto your partner or the person you're with.
So by projecting, you mean blaming?
By blaming, yes, pointing the finger, telling them that it's their fault. Oh, you hurt me. How could you do this to me? Rather say, wow, I'm noticing I'm feeling really angry. And I'm noticing my body's contracting. I'm noticing I can't breathe. I'm noticing I'm feeling really sad and nervous right now. I might not be sure why. Admit that and talk about it. And so those are, two different language settings there, because when I'm able, that's where the turn on is. When I'm able to say, wow, I'm noticing I'm feeling really sad right now, and I'm recognizing that, wow, why am I feeling sad? Well, I'm noticing this tripped me up, and I'm wanting you to hold me more. I'm wanting more connection. And right, that's that vulnerability. And I start getting softer, and the other person's going to just find that ultra turn on.
But this also, there's a dance here, because there's you being able to communicate, first of all, what you're feeling, and also taking ownership over your own feelings. But it's also, the onus is on the other person to respond properly, not like poke fun or become defensive or dismiss it, but actually listen.
Yeah. And that's the key, right? Takes two. And so
exactly. Otherwise you lose trust. I mean, if you're opening up to me and I just dismiss it, or I say that it's wrong or that it's stupid, I'm not hearing your experience. So why would you share your experience with me again in the future?
Correct. And so if there is a relationship that you had one person who was working to do that communication, and the other person was, reacting like that, I would immediately tell him to go hire a professional. And so, or decide, is that the right relationship for you? I know for me, if I'm with someone and they're not communicating at a certain level or degree, I'm not even going to have a conversation with them. And so here are a couple of tips for that. And so one, if you are on the listening end, is in that moment, it's really, sometimes all you need to do is listen. Really, all you need to do is listen. Don't try to fix them. Just listen. Ask for what they need. When all else fails, you ask the person, what do you need? And the thing that often is challenging, I want to say more so for women, and I can own that one, it's more so for women, is often, rather than getting in touch with what we need, we get lost in the story. Okay.
Yeah.
And the person listening will get lost as well, and they're not going to have the presence to listen, and it's not their fault. It's no one's fault. So I can say that I'm a woman and I've done it. And so be mindful in both sides. Compassion, especially if you're just learning, compassion. So listening, asking for what the person needs to the person who's sharing. And the other thing is, again, breaking it down, expressing your feelings, knowing what you're needing from those feelings. And then together creating a scenario. This is where the fun comes in. Wow, I'm noticing I'm feeling sad. I'm noticing this is how my body feels when I'm sad. I'm contracted, I'm shaking, I'm nervous, my heart is fluttering. Identify what's going on. That's going to help you get out of your story. And then come into, God, well, your partner might be, what are you needing right now? Well, I don't know what I need. Well, let's figure it out. Well, in this moment, I might simply need space to just breathe. Just give me a moment. I need some space. The other thing might be, well, could you just hold my hand? Often as partners, even if you just touch knee to knee, without your partner even knowing, it starts to soothe the nervous system. So if someone's really upset and they're sharing stuff, and so or the person might say, I'd love you to hold my hand. I'd love you to maybe tell me what you heard me say. They're going to want to know you're ultra present to them. They might want some empathy from you. They might want you to know that you can understand what they're sharing with you. And those are some big things I just shared. And so look this up, research, study compassionate communication, find ways to be able to know what you're feeling, know what you're needing, and to be able to really listen to your partner.
So would you say that those are the key elements to elevate your communication? Because that was something that you had brought up before when we were chatting before the call. You'd mentioned that there's 3 keys to elevate your communication. Would you say that those are part of those keys?
They are part of those keys. And there's also a process that you could do on the people listening can do on their own, which I highly suggest. So if I can quickly go through that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
please.
I always suggest practice before you start to implement. And so this is where you would get out your journal, get out a pen and paper, and write these inquiries down. And the first one would be, so think of a situation or scenario where it might have upset you, might have triggered certain feelings, and write down the scenario. Just write it out on a page or a paragraph. And then ask yourself the question after you write that out is, what am I feeling? Like, what are you feeling when you reflect on this evaluation and this story, this scenario? And really write out your feelings. Like, boom, I'm feeling sad. I'm feeling angry. I'm feeling rage.
Yeah, and it's paying attention to those emotion words, not necessarily what you're thinking.
Correct.
And there's a difference there.
Yes. So emotion words versus what you're thinking versus what we actually call your story or the evaluation, which is what you're thinking. The next piece, which might be the more difficult piece, is now you're going to ask the question, if you were the other person or people, what do you think they're feeling?
Oh, that's a challenge right there. That's a challenge in compassion and empathy.
And this is going to be important. It's so essential. And so this is why you're doing it in a journal. Take your time, breathe, really feel into it. Take a moment. Just, okay, so if I was them, I'm not saying this situation is right or wrong. It's not what you're doing. But if I was them, what might they be feeling? And write it down. Often, when you write down your feelings and their feelings, if you're really able to put yourself in their shoes, you're going to find that your feelings are very similar. The next piece, the question is simply going to go into, okay, so if I'm feeling this, so go back to what you were feeling, what might I be needing? So really just reflect on that. Okay, so what am I needing? It could be just a very tangible need. So get really clear and to the point, simple. Write it down. Wow, I might need clearer communication. I'm needing more connection. I'm needing you to listen more. I'm needing to take my own space. Just what do you need? And then the next question is going to, again, go to the other person once more. It's going to reflecting on what you wrote down that they were feeling. And now put yourself back in their shoes. What can you imagine they might be needing? And over again, everyone who I've done this process with, the feelings and the needs of both parties are pretty similar. And what happens at the end of that process is the heart starts to open more, right? We've just developed a little bit of empathy there. And now if we choose, sometimes we don't have to. Once that process is done, sometimes people just find peace. And it's like, wow, because sometimes we can't always talk to people because they're not available for it. So this is a great process to find that peace, whether it's practice or if you really can't have the conversation with someone because they're just not in that place in their life to communicate like this with you. And find that peace of, wow, I don't agree with what they did, but I can really understand why they might have made that decision.
That is an incredible exercise.
Thank you. I love it. I love it. And it's so simple, and also it can be very difficult. And I find it's just such a key.
Yeah. So we're going to start to wrap up here. And I guess basically you're an advocate of having these harder conversations in relationships. And I guess it's more so about having the harder conversations with yourself first and then starting to engage with the other person.
Correct. Absolutely.
Is there anything I haven't asked you yet that you feel is maybe a loose end that you'd like to tie up?
I don't. We've covered a lot. I feel really good with what we just conversed about.
Same here. Are there any, would you say that there's one or two key takeaways that you'd like to leave with the listeners from what it is that we've discussed?
Yeah. So a couple key points is trust the stillness, because you have to get still in order to feel. Okay, so number one. Number two is don't be afraid of what you feel because that is holding all the information that you need in order to have really the level of connection and intimacy and relationship that you deserve. And don't be afraid to ask for what you want.
Very poignant. Awesome. Thank you so much, Tziporah, for coming on the show and sharing your love guru knowledge.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a lot of fun.
Now, that was a lot of fun. Let's give a big thank you to our love guru, Tziporah Kingsbury. You know, I really, really, really like how she focuses on embracing our darker sides and like diving into those elements of who we are. Like if we try to avoid those darker parts of who we are, then we're not a whole person. And it's like we're not being truthful with ourselves. And the more we can dive into that, the more whole we are and the more we can actually bring to a relationship. What did you learn today? Send us a message on our Facebook page under this episode or tweet us about what you learned. We'd love to hear your story. If you really felt supported in your sexual expression and growth, then you're like most people. And most people are either ashamed to talk about this stuff or listen to it because it's taboo and something we're expected to just quote unquote know. And this is why we rely on you to share this podcast with your friends and help get the word out there to remove the stigma around sexuality. Who else would you like to hear interviewed? What questions would you like answered? Reach out to us on Facebook at Modern Sex Talks or on Twitter and let us know. We read everything. Thanks for joining our community, and until next time, go be confident, playful, and sexual.